podcast where we explain bands. I'm Olivia Ladd, a music journalist in Nashville. The premise of this podcast is I pick a cult band and find a friend or artist in the Nashville music scene to sit down and talk about the history all the way to the modern day influences of that band. Some update for our subscribers and listeners. Bandsplainer is now part of the We Own This Town network based out of Nashville. You can also now find episodes on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, or wherever you get podcasts. You can find new episodes on weownthistown.net or bandsplainer.show. And be sure to follow Bandsplainer on Twitter. Thanks for listening. Welcome to Bandsplainer, the podcast where we explain bands. I'm Olivia Ladd, and today we are talking about the UK band Squeeze with Charlie Zaillian, who you can go ahead and introduce yourself as a writer around town.
Hi, I'm Charlie Zaillian. I am a writer around town. I guess most prominently for the Nashville scene. Also sometimes Rolling Stone, and before that, Seattle Times out west for a number of years. Moved here in January. So far, so good.
Yeah. So he's like part of the scene now. We met because we both have freelance for Nashville scene, doing like review and feature stuff. So cool connection there. And Charlie had reached out to me about being on the podcast and was one of the only people who like so instantly gave an answer to what band they wanted to do, because usually I like send a list of like 50 bands I have and people are like, oh, I could do this one or maybe this one, and he was like, Squeeze, like that's the band I know the most about, like more than anything else, has like reoccurred throughout my life. And then we met and talked about it, and I heard some like amazing stories about it, and now I didn't know too much about Squeeze, and after like the past couple weeks sitting down researching and listening to their music and hearing Charlie's kind of perspective on it, I'm like a huge fan, and I'm really excited to talk about them today. So the basic introduction is that they're a UK pop band that kind of defined a corner of that market's sound. They formed in 1974 and have kind of had many incarnations throughout the years, which we'll talk about, but they're technically still around today, the core duo, but their peak years were to about the early 80s. So you can probably discuss their formation a bit too. The main two dudes are Chris Difford and Glenn Tilbrook. So Chris Difford was this teenager in South London in a small town, and he saw Pete Townsend on TV and was like really into the idea of like being a rock star. So he put up this ad in a candy store window that was like, he lied. He was like, I have a record deal, I have a band, like I need a guitarist, just to see like who would reach out. And Glenn Tilbrook and his like girlfriend at the time were walking down the street, see the ad, she encourages him to reach out, and they met, and like within a year had written like 50 songs or something. Yeah,
that's just about as I know it. I mean, I feel like Squeeze, for all intents and purposes, began with the second album, Cool for Cats, which I guess we'll get to, but the story of the first one, UK Squeeze, is kind of
interesting.
It's kind of interesting. It's just a sort of classic tale of record label meddling, but not,
which is kind of funny because I feel like with Pulp and Black Flag, like they both had stuff like that. So past episodes we talked about that. So basically they're named after Squeeze by the Velvet Underground, which I think is so awesome. Velvet Underground is like my like favorite band other than Can. So they put out Squeeze in 1973, VU did, and like it was not well received. Like people still this day like don't necessarily love that record, and I get it because like compared to like their self-titled or like White Heat, all that kind of stuff, maybe it's not up to par, but I still think it's a really good record. Like there's some like good stuff on there. Anyway, so they like named their band after this VU record that came out a year before, and John Cale discovers them because of this reason. And so in 1977, a few years later, they like record this EP and they've written all these songs, and they're connected with John Cale. He says he's going to produce it. He meets with them to record their first EP a year later, their first record, and John Cale, like, didn't like the songs they had written. Like, he, like, went up to Chris and he was like, dude, like, the exact quote was, "You've got to stop writing love songs." He was like, "We like, imagine yourself like outside of that and write about things you don't know, or like things that you're imagining a scenario of, and quit writing these little like love songs or whatever." So it's kind of funny. But they put out their first EP in 77 that he produced, called Packet of Three, and then they put out a self-titled first album in 1978. And this had their first two big singles, which are Take Me, I'm Yours, and Bang Bang. And ironically enough, even though Cale is kind of how they got their start, and I love John Cale's production on other stuff, even up to his stuff with like Brian Eno in the 90s, you know, huge fan. He didn't produce either of the singles because the record label didn't think they were commercial enough, which is, you know, of course, ironic, considering he's literally in the Velvet Underground and these are two like teenage dudes in London, or I guess early 20s at that point.
That's really funny. Maybe you know more than me. I'm not even sure there's anything more to the story of how Cale connected with Difford and Tilbrook initially. I mean, it's not like there was like a Google or Velvet Underground song title.
Yeah, in the documentary it said something about maybe Lou Reed was involved, but they didn't elaborate much. So that's all I know too.
What was the documentary?
So the documentary is called Take Me, I'm Yours, which is a BBC kind of TV documentary. So it's only like 50 minutes. So I feel like I got pretty basic information from that. Cool. But if you're listening to the podcast, you should totally watch it because I did learn a lot. Kind of got like a visual aspect for kind of that aesthetic, because I feel like I know a lot about music. Specifically, I always say like the year 1977 to early 80s is like all my favorite music. I've said that in like other podcasts, but I feel like I got like an idea kind of for the aesthetic of the UK during that time that New Wave and all this stuff was happening through that documentary. So that's kind of interesting.
Just a stray observation, just a funny parallel from what you were talking about, that Velvet Underground album, Squeeze, being sort of like not one beloved by the fan base or even the band, but in hindsight, but as a diehard, you can see the value in it, or you can
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I guess that's kind of how I feel about some of the records that we're going to talk about later.
Yeah, it is. And I love that because you can always, the people that work with, like Brian Eno with Devo and stuff, the people that work with these bands at the beginning, you can definitely see a parallel, like within the fan base or within like the history. And that's definitely here with VU. I totally agree with that, because I feel like with specifically the album Squeeze, Velvet Underground was a band I was like definitely into early college, and then like as I like wrote anniversary pieces or learned more about them and did like, you know, deep dive research, I like found that record again and was like, oh, there is value, you know, you do see the value there, it is important, etc. And that is kind of Squeeze, like how we were talking about how they have these different incarnations. There's maybe like kind of weird dynamics in the later stuff, but then you like learn more about them and you hear it, and that's kind of how I was with like their 2010 record stuff. I was like, okay, like the sound is still there, you know, from the beginning. Anyway, so when they originally started this band, like when they did their first record, Chris said that his three biggest influences were the Kinks, Lula Reed, and Glenn Miller. And I feel like that kind of comes back specifically through Jules Holland's like piano playing. You kind of get that like Glenn Miller sound and like kind of the later records. I feel like that's just something maybe I observed. Just you get that kind of like classic sound, but they still kind of sound, there's not one band I could like compare them to, which is what I love about Squeeze. Mm-hmm. So when they put out this self-titled record in 1978, it was called Squeeze, and there was another band in the US called Tight Squeeze. There was some kind of copyright lawsuit, whatever issue. They had to go by UK Squeeze and name the record UK Squeeze when they were selling it in the UK or Australia or the US, whatever. So that record is still known as like UK Squeeze. And then eventually, I guess the next year, they were able to release under just Squeeze.
Like they outlived that other band or something.
Yeah. Apparently they weren't, that other band wasn't a big deal, even though they made a big legal fuss. And Squeeze is still around and they're not, so that's that. So 1979, they put out Cool for Cats, and this was originally what I thought was my favorite Squeeze record, but the more I listened, I found another one I like a bit better. But this is the first one I heard, I think just because I had, like, friends that were, when I first got into, like, XTC and Public Image Limited and stuff like that, this record kind of came up in my, like, intro to new wave kind of level of life, whatever, when I was in college. Yeah, I don't know. Let's talk about Cool for Cats.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, I mean, like, my personal connection to it or the record itself? Or where do you want to begin?
I guess both. Like, this record is really interesting because it's really kitschy. Like, it's really, there's a lot to unpack here. And I think that there's this direct influence because Chris Difford said that when he was, like, a kid, he would watch all these British, like, kitchen sink dramas. So where you have, like, a big issue and it's, like, resolved within 30 minutes or an hour. So it's a clear, like, beginning, middle, and end. And that's, like, what all these songs are.
Sort of like the beginning of, like, the quintessential, like, Difford Tilbrook story song.
Yeah.
Like, a lot of them are self-contained little vignettes. And I mean, it's like, I guess it's the first example of what kind of became a trademark.
Yeah, for sure. And that's, like, this record more than their first two because Cale's influence was so strong there, which is interesting on its own. But Cool for Cats really is kind of like the seminal, like, record for what became their sound and their trademark.
Yeah, it's them stepping out for the first time. I feel like, I mean, maybe almost half, like a third of the songs were singles.
Yeah, which is really interesting. And that is, like, people, like, music journalists have said that, like, the specific Squeeze sound is that it's Glenn and Chris singing together, and it's Glenn singing Chris's lyrics and Chris is singing one octave lower, and that's kind of their whole, like, thing. And then they sing these, like, kitchen sink drama songs, like, quote unquote, and that's, like, kind of their thing. And you listen to Cool for Cats and, like, it's almost funny. Like, some of the songs are, like, hilarious and, like, really out there, but they kind of, like, are these really interesting pop songs that don't sound like any other pop music coming out at that time because they're not quite harmonizing. They're just, like, singing together, creating this really unique voice. Like, voice in, like, the literary sense, too.
Yeah. It's like they make you laugh, but, like, they'll also hit you where it hurts, too.
For sure, which is kind of my favorite kind of music.
Yeah,
I feel like,
same.
Like, yeah, like, even in, like, folk and all that kind of stuff that I listen to, it's, like, stuff that's, like, clever, and then you're like, oh, wow, that's true, like, wow.
And we can get to this, but they're also, like, a crash course in, like, British working class slang.
For sure, yeah. And that's really interesting, because they did kind of bring that to, maybe not the mainstream, but at least the surface level of, like, music, especially for, like, US fans. And then you get Britpop where that's, like, reinforced 2 decades later, though, you know? So it's kind of funny to see that.
Yeah, you might find some parallels between this and your Pulp episode.
Yeah, I feel like a bit. But I feel like this band, Pulp, I love their, like, first 3 records just because they're so, like, weird, like, and awesome. But, like, this, like, they really were figuring out their sound way earlier on. And I think that's interesting because we're going to talk about it, but they kind of have 3 main, I guess, like, eras. So it's, like, 1978 to 1981 is when they put out their, like, first stuff. Then they have, like, their solo breakup years, and then they have, like, the reunion years, which still has some really good stuff in it. But I think, like, the biggest, like, defining era is, like, the first one, and they really did have this, like, specific sound, knew what they were doing, didn't care what other people thought, and, like, we're just doing it, you know? So Cool for Cats is really interesting, and I feel like that was the first record I heard of them, and, like, never thought about them again until we were gonna do this podcast. So I feel like that's a good place to start. It's, like, super digestible because it is very poppy without being, like, too deviant from that sound.
Yeah. And I was going to start talking about standout songs on that record, but I feel like I could have something to say on all of them. But, I mean, I guess, what were your favorites offhand?
Oh, man. I feel like I have to look.
Yeah.
And this also, it should be noted that, like, so later in the episode, we'll talk about some of their later releases, as with many bands that have been around for decades, or re-releases of other songs where they're re-recording or, like, kind of have an anthology thing. And Cool for Cats, like, a lot of those songs get kind of re-recorded.
Kind of like, why?
Yeah, it's kind of like no purpose other than money. It's kind of like the Led Zeppelin releases. I'm always like, do you really need more money? Like, is there a reason to remaster all of those songs that were already perfect or whatever?
Gang of Four did something similar.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, almost identical to Squeeze. I think it was like all their singles from their golden era. And yeah, it was fine, but it didn't add anything new to the proceedings.
Yeah, exactly. So Cool for Cats, I think Up the Junction was one of the first singles of that, but I really like that because I feel like if you're like getting a crash course in new wave, like there's a lot you could skip over, but I feel like bands like this are way more interesting than like going straight into Talking Heads or something like that when you're getting into the genre. And so I feel like Up the Junction and The Knack and like Slightly Drunk and Cool for Cats, I would say, for me.
That's great.
Yeah, we're like the ones that stood out.
Yeah. And Up the Junction is, interesting in a lot of ways. It's definitely a one of those self-contained story songs about sort of just like the beginning, middle, and end of a relationship. And it's, I guess, compositionally, it's interesting in that it's just one part, just played in different keys to sort of, I don't know, mirror the rising and falling action in the story. And
I think that's kind of, like we were saying, is an example of, like, what became their signature thing, because a lot of these songs were literally, like, 3-chord songs. Yeah. But it's, like, the fact that they're telling a story that's self-contained within a 3-minute, whatever. So it's, like, is a very unique way of going about writing to where it's not, like, some repeating verse and chorus, kind of, like, whatever song. It's still very unique.
The Knack is an example of the sort of the kitschiness
you're talking about. Yeah, and I think that's the one I remember, like, driving around when I was first kind of starting research for this one and, like, listening to that and, like, repeating that song and being like, this is, like, these lyrics are insane. Like, who would put this in a song? It's, like, so funny. It's super kitschy, but I love it.
Yeah, it's like adorably foreboding.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but I feel like you were saying you listened to Cool for Cats as, like, a kid. I feel like this is totally, like, kind of a childish, like, I don't know, not in a bad way, but, like, a childish kind of record. Like, it has this really, like, youthfulness to it, and, like, the lyrics and stuff. It's, like, really fun.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, it works on several levels. I guess, like a lot of great art. I mean, a parallel I can think of from growing up, like, something that might be, like, reaching here, but that also had a new wave connection was the TV show Rugrats, which I appreciated on one level, and that my parents could appreciate. It's like for them for too.
Which, that's funny. This is the second Rugrats mention on this podcast because Mark Mothersbaugh from Devo did the theme song for that, so it's
that's what I'm getting at. Yeah.
No, but that is funny. Because I was talking about that too. That was like, you said Cool for Cats was one of your first records, Squeeze being your first live show ever.
Yeah. I mean, Squeeze was my parents' jam. It was like just like their kind of a band that had always been a mainstay for them. Like being my mom specifically, like new wavers in LA and in the late 70s, early 80s. And kind of tuned out for a while when I was around, but they still had, their tapes, and that's what we would jam in the car. And I think Cool for Cats, I don't know how it found its way to me, but I think it was just kind of the artwork. I guess kind of what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's
gonna pop for like accessible. A little kid.
Yeah, it's like this purple, like fun, like pop art, like funny, like 80s font, well, I guess late 70s, but like super like pointy, new wave, angular. So it is just like a fun record, and I feel like that's what you were saying, like when your parents have kids, they quit keeping up with music, but they have those like mainstays, and that's like even on a, I guess, more mainstream level, like Bob Dylan for me, like my parents definitely weren't into new wave or anything cool, but like Bob Dylan was like my first record of all time was Free Will and Bob Dylan, and so that's like kind of the same thing where you listen to it as a kid and you like it for one reason, and then you get older and it kind of reveals its wisdom and pieces, and like you understand different parts about art. And I mean, that's with a lot of bands, but I feel like Cool for Cats is kind of a record like that. And that's definitely when I first listened to it, when I was getting into new wave, I kind of appreciate for its sound. And then I kind of appreciated the pop aspect of it when I re-listened to it.
Slightly Drunk, not a single, but definitely a standout.
Yeah,
to me. I've heard it described as Beatles on speed.
Nice. Yeah, I definitely would actually just describe Squeeze as that. Like in some of their music, like it definitely sounds like the Beatles on speed. That's a great description.
And I guess that's also something that's, I mean, defined and also to a degree dogged Tilbrook and Difford over the years is just. I mean, the UK press, if you know anything about them, they like to make bold, over-the-top declarations. I mean, they just kind of, get excited about being the ones to break something, anything.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, just on looks and sound alone, just like a couple pure pop people, two-songwriter band. They're gonna get the Lennon-McCartney next Lennon-McCartney comparison, and it's not something that they ever asked for.
Yeah, I don't think.
And it's
so
not
either.
it's not unearned either, but it kind of takes away from their own accomplishment.
Yeah, it's not out of bounds, but I don't think that's what they were going for. I mean, at that point, Lennon and McCartney had barely finished doing the Beatles, so it's like I really don't think that's the sound they were going for. But I get that, like with everything, when people are writing about a band, you have to compare it to something populist for people to understand it, I guess.
Or in this case, to sell magazines.
To sell it, yeah. But the Lennon and McCartney thing is kind of a stretch, I feel like. But I get the comparison being a UK pop band.
I just don't think they were setting out to do anything in particular. I think they're just figuring out who they were. Especially this, I mean, they're like, it's easy to forget. But, I mean, one, just how prolific, like, every band of prominence was back then. It was like a record a year, and that was just like how it was done. But like these guys were like 21, 22.
Yeah, they were really young. And that is a good point to make. I actually wrote a note about that, is that they put out a ton of records, like this band over the years. Like even the beginning, it literally was like one record a year, and that's just because that's how the industry worked.
Yeah.
And it was like record a record, sell physical copies, like whatever. And now we have streaming, and you have to sell a single, and radio works so much differently post 1996. Because of the commercialization and monopoly of media and all that. But it really is interesting, and I think that's why I always love this kind of era of bands, because their work ethic is crazy. Like, they're putting out a record a year.
They're shooting from the hip. Like, there's no time to think. So they're just sort of evolving creatively
as they go
speed.
without realizing it.
Yeah.
Which is the beauty of it, because I think when you have too much time to think about what you're doing, you're purposely being oh, we have to reinvent and brand. And I think that's a big thing today with bands, is sometimes stuff feels so commercialized, even if it's an independent record or artist, and there's authenticity there's creativity there, but it's definitely everything is branded. And I get it, everything anyone does has to be. But here they're oh, well, we're making a record, and then they just make a record, and they evolve naturally as people do, as creatives.
And I imagine just the set list. I mean, other bands that come to mind think of this era for me are Elvis Costello and the Attractions, and
which is a big influence here.
Mm-hmm. I mean, they're peers,
1981 record.
Contemporaries, even worked together at various points. But also Talking Heads and Husker Du over here in the States.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, just 78, 84 golden
For sure, which is kind of funny. I've been getting back into, proto-punk is like always my favorite, or like new wave, whatever, but I just read The Rules of Attraction by Bret Easton Ellis, so he talks about talked about Husker Du and Squeeze in the book, and I was like, oh,
really?
like full circle, like how funny, like I've been like researching this, and I like the book I'm reading is talking about this, so I like had made a playlist of all the songs he mentioned in that book, and like noticed a lot of comparisons to this band, which was really interesting. Playlist. Yeah,
that's tight.
So 1980 they put out Argy Bargy, and Paul Carrick from Roxy Music joined. Okay. Pulling Muscles from Michelle is the most prominent song from this, and was like a big hit for them in the UK and kind of made it in the US, and I think that's a great song if you're gonna get into this band. That's definitely one of their most commercially successful. Mm-hmm. And it's funny because it's like, I think they described it as like a stone ditty that they wrote. Like, it doesn't make sense. They were just like messing around, and it's like a really good song though. Like it's like a good one, you know? What do you feel about this?
Well, I remember it's kind of funny. Like, I heard "Cool for Cats" so many times before ever hearing anything else by them, and I think we were talking about this when we first met, about like getting into a band before you've really gotten into music, and how
that like skews your perspective on music and the band.
It's a mind-blowing concept that they actually have more albums.
Yeah, because you don't think about that when you're a kid. You're like, oh, this is like. You don't know what art, you don't know about careers, you don't think about bands, you know, like whatever. No. And
you don't even think, you don't think about like these songs coming from humans.
Yeah, it's just like something you hear and you enjoy, and you don't think further on it. And that innocence really allows you to like enjoy and have a really interesting perspective on music. But so to go back and hear other work by artists you heard when you were a kid later is like the funniest thing to me, because like even as an adult I'll do that, like pick up, you know, who like Eurythmics or something, where I heard one or two songs my mom played like Sweet Dreams every day of my life, and then it'd be like, oh wow, Annie Lennox like did this, and like they have other songs together, like that's never thought about it. But yeah, so Argy Bargy.
I feel like this one is definitely maybe a little more streamlined, or like a little more up tempo in general. The Farfisa organ is a major player on this record. You can also heard on like the Attractions and countless other stuff from this time. This one and the next one, East Side Story, the song, the track listings kind of bleed together for me.
For sure.
Because also, I mean, we'll get to this, but all of these albums plus the fifth one, Sweets from a Stranger, the singles are all collected on the singles 45s and under comp, which a lot of people say you could just like buy that,
listen to that,
be done with Squeeze, and yes and no. It's
a good way to like get into it and like
and
hit all the high points.
They're all bangers, but
they are.
But Argy Bargy, great, energetic, fun album.
And this is like, once again, like Cool for Cats is like where they're getting into that sound, and this is like, oh hey, like we know what we're doing, we've evolved, and like whether intentionally or not, that one is a good one. Now in 1981, so this is like next year, they literally put out 5 records in a row, whatever. East Side Story comes out in 1981, and it's produced by Elvis Costello.
That's
and
right.
I think after I've listened to like the playlist you made and kind of listening to like vaguely everything in order, all the records, like kind of in passing as I was driving or cleaning my house or whatever, I think East Side Story is like kind of my favorite record by them. Like I really like it, and that's like the one I've revisited. And the song specifically, I want to say either Is That Love or Messed Around, maybe. I don't know. I think those are my favorite. And I think it's interesting because the Elvis Costello influence is really here, and even more so than their first record, you kind of get that like Kinks and Glenn Miller sound. It almost sounds like a British pop version of like Roy Orbison or something on some of these. I
mean, Labeled with Love is like straight up like a country song,
which I love. Oh my god, because it's like pop. I don't know, I feel like country is a better basis for kind of like any sound you're going for than like classic rock, in my opinion. Like, I love country, I write about country, but like as far as pop stuff, like the country structure of that, like Labeled with Love, like is kind of a country song. And I love, like I always joke that my favorite genre is like country that isn't country or something, but like I would include that in that. Like it really is like super influence on that. But oh man, I love this record. It's like so good, and Jules Holland like kills it every single song on the keyboard and organ on this one. It's like so interesting.
Yeah, I guess, and I could see what you're saying with the Costello influence, that he's like, I mean, such a musical omnivore, chameleon like type guy, and so they really like the palette after doing sort of a straight up like new wave record, this one really for just being a year later, I don't know, expands the palette.
Yeah, and that's the crazy thing. That's like I was listening to an interview with like Dave Cobb and Jason Isbell and stuff today, and they talked about obviously the Beatles, which, whatever your opinion is, they did cover all this stuff, you know, so quickly, like whatever. And I think this band did the same thing. Like you have to keep in context listening, just what we're talking about now, keep in context that like this literally is like, once again, like year after year they're putting out a record. And so East Side Story compared to the other ones like just blew my mind, and that's why I think it's my favorite, because I was like, they changed their sound so much, and it's like, you know, 3 years later, like that's crazy.
Yeah, actually the first track on that is almost kind of a ruse, in that like it sounds like something from the previous record.
Yeah,
like,
and
just
so
like
it kind of flows effortlessly, which is kind of the funny thing. When I listened to it in order, there wasn't like a definite beginning or end.
Maybe that's why I link those two records. Yeah. Maybe in quintessence, that first track is the bridge.
For sure.
Just like, yeah, another super fast pop song. East Side Story also contains Tempted. And Tempted is arguably, I mean, I don't know if like measure it in just like its chart performance or what, or just its like cultural significance, but it's probably their biggest hit.
Yeah.
And the like cruel irony is that it's not sung by either of the two key guys, Difford or Tilbrook. It's this guy Paul Carrick, who joined one album prior.
Yeah, he joined in 1980, who was with Roxy Music and then later other bands, which is, it's always the irony. That's kind of how like Whip It, being Devo's biggest hit, is like their like song making fun of popular music kind of thing. So it kind of does suck that their biggest hit is like not sung by either of them, when their quintessential sound is like them singing together. So it is kind of
it's just funny. I mean, it's
as it goes with cult bands, they kind of like get, you know, looked over for stuff like that.
But yeah, Tempted by the Fruit of Another probably rings a bell if you ever listened to 80s flashback
I feel like
session on the radio.
That is one people would recognize, because that is like still
that and Pulling Muscles, I think.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So then the fifth one. Are we done with East Side Story?
Yeah. I think that's all I have to say. That's just
also a great. Just the title is also
I know,
great.
It's so
just
good.
like a shout out to their Southeast London origins,
which kind of goes back into the working class, like kind of UK theme here, which I do like.
Yeah, Piccadilly, another good one off that record.
Yeah.
So many story songs. Sweets from a Stranger is one. The fifth album is, I think, maybe to me the first misstep, or like where the winning streak might have ended. I mean, I there was one huge hit off it, Black Coffee in Bed, which is kind of another kind of weird one. It's like a 6.5 minute kind of lazy, not a dirge, but
I kind of like that song though, in a weird way. Like that's,
I'm not
like,
bagging on it.
No, yeah, but I feel like that's like a song that like on its own is kind of interesting. I don't know how I would feel, or within the context of that album, I don't like just dig it all, you know, that album together. I don't not like it, but that song I feel like is kind of a standalone, because it is just really weird and directionless, kind of, and it's interesting.
And that sort of maybe, I mean, mirrors where the band was at that time. I mean,
yeah, because this is right before they break up. They do that record. Yeah, I don't know. That's what I kind of love when talking about the history of like any band, is you really can see the strain just any, like, the relationship and synergy of a band is always going to be reflected in their sound at that time. And so that is, like, one thing about this record. If you're interested in, like, obviously this podcast and, like, going through and listening, you do see, like, they're tense. There's, like, members leaving the band. Like, Paul Carrack kind of causes tension with that hit and stuff.
Possibly,
or not,
yeah.
like, I guess not him as a person, but just the fact that they're, like, kind of moving away from the sound and all that. It's super reflected in that.
And maybe even the times are moving away from that sound.
Yeah,
and
for sure, because you're getting into the mid 80s now, and that's like where new wave, all the best new wave kind of happened a little before that, which new wave, you know, like at that point it's kind of like a genre. It's not like the beginnings of it anymore, or like people creating a new sound. It's kind of like going off of what's already been done, which is
a little bit like a band without a country. Or
yeah, for sure. So after that, they break up, and Difford and Tilbrook are still friends and do like this joint record, which I feel like you could like talk more on than I could. It's a good record. It's more like pop and a little folky to me.
It's a record that definitely sounds like the way the sleeve looks. It's like
I love that. Yeah,
I do my best to describe it, but they're like in a abandoned house on the beach in like just like cold ass beach in England somewhere, like wearing like the like hair is all like fluffy and like blowing
real
in the
80s,
wind.
yeah.
Super 80s.
Real 80s.
And like we're like wearing trench coats and
very UK, very 80s, very on
very
brand.
like serious artiste, but they end up looking silly. And yeah, it's definitely like it's trying to it's the first of many records I think are sort of like a square peg trying to fit in the round hole of what's popular, yet their sort of pop instincts still save it from being totally embarrassing. Like, there's still a few songs that are legit. Which is kind of like the irony of the
whole band is like they're a great pop band. They are pop by nature, but then like after I guess 1985 onward, they like literally, or a little before that, they struggle to like stay quote unquote popular or populist,
or maybe
with what
overly
the
concern
is.
Themselves with
True,
it.
or maybe try to overcompensate. But they are like such good pop artists by definition of like what a good pop song is, which I think is like easily understandable lyrics or like telling a story and like a catchy hook and like good songwriting and like only a few chords, not like too much noise going on, which love noise bands, love like crazy sounds and all that weird stuff. But like as far as pop music, that's what they did. That's what made them great. So the solo record or duo solo record, whatever, is really
Difford and Tilbrook, it's called simply.
Yeah.
You can get it for like 25 cents anywhere.
This is
on
probably,
any format.
Yeah, you can find a lot.
Actually, I mean, I don't know how it is now, but for a long time before the like so-called vinyl revival, this was a band that you could generally count on at a good used record store getting all the essentials for like $10.
Yeah, and that's awesome. That's another good thing that makes a good pop band. Like you should be able to like, it should be accessible, and I love like. That's good. And this is a band I feel like you could, if you want to get into them, it's still definitely like a cult band, but like you get into this band as like a young person getting into music, and like you could like hear a lot of sounds that lead you to other stuff. Like you could go Talking Heads to, you know, like we were saying, Roy Orbison. Like you could find a lot of classic influence here from this kind of newer sound, which I think is interesting. And then when you get in their later stuff, you get into weirder stuff kind of based off of them. But yeah, I feel like it is accessible, and this record is kind of like pretty popular within that genre. Yeah, because at this point they had a following too. So even nowadays, people that were into them like would have bought this record or still do.
As far as the next phase, I mean, I think it's it's worth noting that there were like a lot of UK bands, as far as I know, just significantly more successful commercially in the UK than they ever were over here. And part of that, like them, like The Jam and like other certain bands, the knock on them is like they're too British for mainstream acceptance in America. And just like that, like,
which to me is America's problem and not their problem.
Sure, yeah, like we're not going to take the time to decode these lyrics that are really not too
it's
crazy
not hard,
if you just think about it.
Exactly, it's just kind of like euphemisms and idioms and stuff like that, which is
that's great stuff to know.
Yeah, which is like kind of the glory of Chris's like songwriting is that it is full of these like funny idioms that are kind of like made up or whatever and like uniquely British. But I think that's a big problem with like kind of American radio music is there's a beauty to it, like Americana as a canon being like so like consistent, but then also that like still today people are like, oh well, I don't get it, it's British or whatever, and it's like it's not that much of a cultural bridge, you know, like it's just kind of uniquely its own.
Speaking of, did you have any favorite one-liners that jumped out at you?
Oh man, I wish I feel like I need to re-listen and think about that. I feel like the biggest ones would be in Cool for Cats.
Yeah.
I should have taken notes on that because now I can't think of it.
Oh no, I mean I have years of listening on you. But,
what are your favorites?
But my favorite one is from that, and that's on seeing my reflection, I'm looking slightly rough, which is to say, I look like shit.
Yeah. It's just like, it's like this kind of like poetically coded way of saying like really basic things, which all about, that's like the, you know, kind of
or
best
like
songwriting.
On the first song on that record, Slap and Tickle, not Cool for Cats, that record. You have to throw the stone to get the pool to ripple. Like no one's gonna do it for you.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah, it's good, and that's
make it
like
happen on your own.
Oh yeah, oh man, such good songwriting, really good, like catchy stuff. I love that, and it's like it is a little kitschy, like, and it's not quite corny, but like it's there, and I really, there's just not another band like them for that reason, for stuff like that, which I dig.
So, did you listen to Cozy Fan Tutti Frutti at all?
Yeah, I did.
Thoughts?
It's different. So this is like after their breakup, and they've replaced quite a bit of the members. So this came out in 1985. So keep that for context. You're like in the 80s here.
I mean, it's funny after going for the pop jugular on the Difford and Tilbrook album. This is the immediately next thing, and the first track on that, which I put on your playlist, is Big Bang, which is probably the most like inscrutable, like just like, I mean, Squeeze at their most experimental.
Yeah,
like I have
noisy.
no idea what they're even going
like
for, but
the biggest like way I would describe this record is just layered, and it is actually so layered that they recorded like 2 keyboards over each other on every song on this, and they couldn't replicate what they had done live, so they were kind of in a scramble when they had to go on tour. So they get Jules' like 17-year-old brother on stage with a keyboard to play alongside him, because they were like, there's no way we can replicate this sound without adding members to the band. And I think that's like so funny, because they were like, what have we done? Like, we've made this weird sound, and now we like don't know how to
that's funny.
keep on
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and so they have this like 17-year-old kid come on tour and like play keyboard weird noises in the organ and keyboard to like keep up with what they've like created.
Needless to say, this record wasn't a hit, but
in the popular scale, no.
Yet,
I dig it though. It's experimental.
Yet the next one was.
Which I guess it is kind of their transitional thing, and it's also worth noting, so like they put out East Side Stories 1981, which is like their last good one, I think, before Babylon and On, and then 1985 is Cozy Fan Tutti Frutti. And so during their breakup, the reason they kind of break up is Jules Holland gets recruited for a TV show on BBC called Later ... with Jules Holland,
which like he still hosts to this day.
Yeah, to this day he has it. It's like this incredibly long running, really interesting kind of review show. And the funny thing, another like full circle thing, is so I do like a radio show, and so I had to put this interview on it the other week with Dave Rawlings and Jillian Welch talking about playing at the Ryman. And so they played at the Ryman like years ago for Jules Holland's TV show, and they were talking about that TV show was their breakout in the UK, like sold out records in the UK because they were on Jules Holland's TV show. And I was like, that's so funny. So that TV show actually did give, like, it still does, kind of gave breakout exposure for like undeveloped or like up and coming artists in a lot of genres, and it was filmed in America, UK, wherever he was. So it's kind of interesting that he is such a good player that I feel like he kind of did have this eye to like find other people.
I could be wrong, but I also feel like maybe at some point, like way ahead in the timeline, his brother did take over on.
He probably did. Yeah, I should probably look that up. But yeah, because his brother, that's how he got started, was in 1985, like going on tour with them. So it's kind of funny that they did like give this kid a career because they like needed a keyboardist, which I guess is
because they made an album that was impossible to play.
Yeah, they were like, oh no, what have we done? And have to fix it.
So yeah, I think by now, like now in '88, we're down to 3 original members.
Yeah.
Different Tilbrook and then the drummer, Gilson Lavis.
Yeah, because they've switched out like 3 or 4 bassists at this point. I didn't even like keep note at that point because it was like so many. So they put out Babylon and On in 1987. And then they go into these like compilation records. And is this where the 45 one is released, or is that a little later?
No, that was during the initial breakup.
Okay.
I think. Like,
so that was actually before. Okay.
Yeah, but Babylon and On was strangely, I still don't even like. It's still kind of inexplicable to me, but it was their like long-awaited U.S. breakout record.
Yeah, and I think that's one that just kind of had to come with time. And that's, to me, that's the only reasonable, I guess, explanation is that it was just that they were at this point in their career, after they did this weird experimental record, they were at this point in their career where they made this successful pop record just because they had enough exposure overseas. Like, it took a decade for America to be like, oh, there's this band happening, whatever, because America seems to be a little late to like trends, even like genres adopting other genres. It's always like 5 or 10 years later. It's like cool, but in a way that kind of like kept their legacy going because they're kind of burning out. It definitely did buy them time to continue their career.
Yeah, there's some solid songs I like off that. Hourglass is was the biggest hit, which is just like singing like 1 million words a minute. And there's like a accompanying video that was like also just very of its late 80s time, like Salvador Dali inspired video. I don't know if you pulled that.
Which I really, that's really interesting because I'm really into like, I don't know, this is also an era where like, just kind of that kind of like absurd art and like Dada and like all like weird impressionism and whatever, and then like you see that in music like relatively, you know, not like exact years, but that is kind of funny to see that reflected. And they did kind of branch off visually just because they had the commercial platform to do so here.
The singles collection didn't come out around this time, but you know what did was a live album.
That was like right after Babylon and On was a live album.
Yeah, exactly. Around and About, that one's called. And I think it sort of speaks to the thing that we have been talking about, that like strip away any and all like kind of questionable production choices and the songs stand together.
Yeah, which is I think 80s music in general. You have to like you have to like be like, okay, it was the 80s, so this is why it sounds like that. If you take away this weird production, oh wow, good song. So you gotta take it with a grain of salt. So the live one is interesting though, because you do get kind of the evolution there, as with any live album you're ever gonna listen to. But I'm like a huge live album advocate.
Are
you know,
you?
like I feel like when I was first getting into music, that was like what drew me in, was like listening to artists' live albums, whether it be Velvet Underground, Grateful Dead, to like really weird random bands. So I really dug this live album because you do see like kind of the evolution, because you can go back and watch videos from them playing when they were 20 whatever to like now. You kind of get to take away that production or any like forethought you have about the band, and you get this really like clear, pure like example of their music in the live setting, and I love that. 1989 they put out this record called Frank, which gets re-released later in the 90s as like a remastered deluxe whatever edition, as a lot of their later stuff did, interestingly. Like Sweets from a Stranger gets put back out in 2007 and all this stuff.
This one's my personal favorite of like I guess the post Golden Era stuff. Yeah. It's first of their late 80s output that doesn't necessarily sound like that's where it comes from. Like it's a for lack of a better term, it's a back to the source kind of rock record.
And I feel like they do, because they have enough commercial success to kind of go back to that original sound here.
Yeah, and I just think something about, I feel like it's the sound of them just trusting their gut and settling into middle age and like being cool with that, and writing some of like their most poignant material. I think the 2 songs that kick off the A and B sides respectively are If It's Love and Love Circles. Not to be confused with Is That Love, which we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, earlier.
And I think both of those are on the live album.
Yeah, they are. It's a little confusing.
But, I mean, they are nothing if not consistent thematically. Just really, I don't know, poetic.
Yeah. I don't know. I do like this record. It's
cool. I'm
good.
glad to hear.
Yeah.
This is another track on that Can of Worms, just like about divorce or just like telling kids, helping your kids understand what's going on.
Yeah.
It's like, whoa.
Obviously, like with any band, as they mature, so is their subject material. So they're not singing about cats, even though it's a metaphor. They're singing about like divorce and things, which is like, wow, it's like, okay, like they have the serious material and they're like adults now. And it's funny that they're singing about this subject matter when this record is their most, like you were saying, post-Golden Era, like most relatable back to their early sound as like teenagers, or like, you know, those like three, Lula Reed, the Kinks, and Glenn Miller, like influence there.
And this record was also a complete flop commercially, and I'm sure that I don't know
as a lot of deeper content goes, but it's also like it's 1989, it's like, you know, 1989, 1990, like that's a new era of music where things are changing in the industry, in radio, and like sound, and so the whole UK to US transfer is also a little lost there, I think.
It kind of, I think, just fell through the cracks.
Yeah.
But no, I love that one, and it's
it
cool
seems
to give
like
it
if
a
it had
shout
been
out.
put out 10 years earlier or something, it would be this like super classic record.
Sure, or even
Unfortunately.
5.
Yeah, literally, it just seems like a little out of place with time, just because the 90s, like for me, there's just this oversaturation, and like I don't like a lot of 90s music, and you lose a lot of stuff that like was really good, or is maybe that's why these bands are like cult bands or cult classics or like indie records, because like they were good records, but just like you can't compare to what was playing on the radio then, like they weren't, you know, whatever.
I think Frank also has a special place in my heart, just because it's when I saw them for the first time as a kid.
Yeah,
it was
talk
on that
about
tour.
that. That was your first concert.
It was my first concert.
Yeah, that's
I
awesome.
like to say I remember a lot about it. I don't really.
Yeah.
But I remember I was there. It was... I was with my family in New York, winter of 1989. So I guess they still had enough clout to book Madison Square Garden, but
which says something. There's something there.
Sure,
to be said, yeah.
Certainly not enough at that point to come anywhere close to filling it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think at that point, I think my parents had tuned back in, and they had that tape, and we were all super into it, and I just remember specifically just like watching that song "If It's Love" from my dad's shoulders.
Nice.
That's a fond memory, up there with watching the Dodgers win the 1988 World Series with him a year prior. But I digress. Yeah, I feel like that closes the book on an era for them too.
I think so, for sure. Because, I don't know, I really like that record. Now I want to revisit it now that, I don't know, I've heard your, like, sentimental look on it. But it is, like, a sentimental record just by default. But after this, everything they put out is okay, or it's, like, a re-release,
it's like
or
too
remaster.
middle-aged.
Yeah.
A lot of it.
Yeah, it's very much... But the 90s were an interesting era for them because they still were a band. They were still touring. They definitely weren't as big as they were, but they had people like Amy Mann come in and sing harmonies and like tour with them, and like Bruce Hornsby was like their session keyboardist. So Jules Holland left permanently at this point, and so instead of like replacing him, because they couldn't really replace him, like because he was so important in the band, and like especially like I was saying on my favorite record, like he really like synthesized the whole sound that I dug from them. They had different session keyboardists.
He's kind of a secret weapon. Huh?
He is, like, and I feel like in every band there's like someone who's totally
the ace in
underrated.
the hole, I like to call him,
and he really is. Like he really brings that like kind of 50s pop sound that like makes it so classic and so lovable to the records.
Yeah, he's got some great moments on Frank too. I mean, they're kind of like almost like comic relief from the heavier material we were talking about.
Yeah,
like there's like his New Orleans song, Dr. Jazz, which is silly, but it's fun.
Yeah.
And
I like that too. That's kind of like the thing where it's like country songs that aren't country. Yeah. And that's kind of the same thing because I grew up like super close to New Orleans. So that's kind of the whole basis for my like taste in music. That was kind of like on a tangent. Like I saw like a blues artist weekend and was like, oh, that's why I'm a music journalist. Like I remembered. And so it's kind of funny to see like stuff that's like a New Orleans jazz song that isn't.
Yeah.
But it kind of is. It's kind of a play on that. And I do like that song because it's kind of funny. Like it reminds me, to me, that's nostalgic because it like reminds me of the other stuff I used to listen
You grew up
to.
sort of midway between New Orleans and Memphis, or closer to New
Yeah,
Orleans?
I'm from like Jackson, and then so like I definitely just like Delta blues and jazz is like, you know, where I kind of, that was like the
Nice.
live music I was seeing, and so I feel like that gives me an interesting perspective on music. I feel like I'm going on a tangent, but
No, I mean,
it definitely, I don't know, I feel like a lot of other people grew up either, especially in Nashville, everyone's like, oh, my parents were in the music industry, like I listen to all this cool music, and I'm like, my parents listen to like country radio, but I did like get to see BB King live and like stuff like that. So
but
it's,
the
like,
the '90s mean nothing to you is interesting.
yeah. I wasn't really alive for, I have no memory of like most of the 90s because I wasn't born until 96. I have this super old perspective on music, so just because I grew up listening to like old guys playing some steel guitar or something, so I feel like when I go back and listen to bands like this, like Squeeze or whatever, I do feel like I can see that kind of influence, like, you know, comparing to like older songwriters or pop artists or something, which is kind of interesting. But the 90s for them was, you know, they just weren't like commercially successful up there just because like they weren't with what was popular, and
Well,
that's
like, I mean,
fine. It happened to a lot of people.
Post Nirvana, just like forget about it.
Really? Yeah. I mean, it just kind of wrecked like a lot of people's trajectory to like have this like grunge thing, and I hate that because like that's like a thing I feel like I like joke around with friends a lot or talk about a lot, but like good bands that inspired like just bad bands, and that's, to me, it happened a lot in the 90s.
Yeah.
Like people were like, oh, Nirvana, and it's like I respect Nirvana, but then they made just like garbage music from that, and that's what became popular, and it like made a lot of artists get lost out on, and like, you know, that just weren't like given the attention they deserved during that time. And maybe it's not fair to say that about Squeeze, because they definitely had their time in the sun and like their highlight, whatever, and like at this point, like we said, we're getting a little middle-aged, but yeah, like the 90s just kind of like ruined things for a lot of cool bands because they couldn't compete with this like post-grunge
Or
sound.
just forced them to scale it way back. I mean, or it probably became more like work, and you can hear that in some of this.
It made
it
like a grueling sound, or a grueling effort that like turned that into a sound.
I mean, like all of their stuff. Not to say that there's any album that is worthless, but yeah, I mean, I guess to their credit, they did not try and conform to the sound of the time this time around.
Yeah.
But I guess shout out to the song "Some Fantastic Place" off the album of the same name from '93, and then "Letting Go" off of "Play" from 1991. If only because if you ever go see Glenn Tilbrook solo, those are songs that he considers among his best.
Nice.
And I think it's more like lyrically they mean a lot.
So you've seen Glenn Tilbrook? You have?
Yeah, many times, a few times. I mean, one show I think I told you about that was like a kind of inadvertent solo show, which was I think the first time I went and saw them as being old enough to truly remember it with my Squeeze superfan family. And I gave you the date, but I believe it was in 1999. And yeah, at that point they did have something new, but they were playing like casinos and stuff. Like it was they were definitely on that
stage
circuit
of their
by
career.
then. And probably not totally stoked on it, but they're lifers, you know, and they're pros. But we arrived at the show to find out that Difford hadn't made the flight, and this was day one of a month-long tour. And I don't know what ended up happening, but they did not cancel the show. And not only that, like, we learned just the enormity of Tilbrook's musical contribution to the band, just carrying the weight for two guitarists, and really
to be able to do that all of a sudden is crazy.
To really make lemonade out of a situation and give us like a show that would probably arguably more memorable than it would have been if things had just gone to plan.
True.
And I think that was sort of like where we became fans, not just of the band alone, but of him. Like, just, yeah, I mean, his guitar playing just blew our minds. And yeah, I think there's like a Hendrix cover in there. There's like just kind of really like electrifying versions of like both seminal material and like deep cuts.
Nice,
and,
yeah, which is like all you can ask for.
Yeah,
you want a little bit of both. So,
yeah, we left like hoping Difford was okay, but also just stoked on Tilbrook. Then saw him again in like a few years later. He like went electronica, quote unquote, was like the buzzword.
Okay.
He tried his hand at that,
which I feel like is only what could happen. Like once you get into the 2000s, like every solo branch of like someone from a band, it was like some kind of electronic project, which is like there's some good ones out there.
Hey, he's a dad. He likes his gadgets and I mean, again, it's just like it's the album, The Incomplete Glenn Tilbrook, is frankly just like hilarious sounding, but definitely a pretty lo-fi foray into electronic music. But still, I mean, it's still just his pop songs.
Yeah.
Just
which at the end
dressed
of the day,
up that at the end of the day, yeah, like
every single release
with an acoustic guitar, like these songs are sick.
Yeah.
And so yeah, that was uncovering another side of him. Saw like I think like maybe a 30th anniversary tour of like the golden era early material.
Nice. Which is always interesting to see early stuff played decades later, because it's always going to sound different. It's always still satisfying to hear, though, you know.
Super satisfying. I mean, there weren't really any surprises at that one, but it was good seeing Difford in good health, and and I think they really like, put their best foot forward trying to replicate the old live sound for those of us who couldn't have been there.
Yeah, and I love that. Like I was saying, like I miss the 90s and I love old music. So like every time I like see a band, it's obviously like 20 plus years after their heyday, and I'm like, so it's nice when they do try to, like when I saw the Breeders or whatever a few months ago, like I was like, okay, show. Like, but to be able to see bands like that I like were so important to me, like as a teenager or something, but then I'm like, oh, they're all like 40 or 50 now, but then like when they try their best live to like make it sound like they're not that old, or like
yeah, I mean like down to the clothes if they can still fit into them, like down to the gear if they held on to it.
Yeah, and it's like really cool because to be able to see a legacy show and kind of like get that sound and kind of feel like that's as close as you're gonna get to like music that was important to you, seeing it live is always cool. So that is really good that they did that. And then to be able to see like, oh, they're still going, like they're like that was kind of the Breeders, like they're sober now, they're like actually sound like just as good as they did back in the day, and I was like, that's really cool that they like held it together.
I didn't see him back in the day, but I think her voice sounds better than it ever has.
Yeah, no, I think so, because it also has like very, I feel like Kim Dill and Kathleen Hanna, there's like obviously comparison there, but I saw Kathleen Hanna and her voice is so, like 2 years ago, her voice is so mature now, as it did kind of once they were in La Tigre and stuff, but after she like got over her sickness a little bit, and I feel like that's Kim Dill, like her voice just matured like as like a person, and then to be able to hear them live, and obviously they've become better players since then, etc., etc. I don't know, with any legacy band, it's really interesting to hear them play old material years later.
Well, they're also playing it with a clearer mind,
True.
Just,
I
mean, not just talking about like sobriety, but also just like, I think like a lot of bands break up like because over just like stuff they can't even remember.
No, exactly. Which is like in life, anything. Yeah, like
friend breakups.
Yeah, exactly. You like break up with a friend, and 3 years later, like, what did we fight about? Like, and you have this clear mind about like who you are as people. And I think bands do that too. So that's really cool that Squeeze like kind of came back and like gave that to the fans, kind of thing. Yeah,
they're still going. You can still go see them. I haven't in a while, but I hope
I like kind of
again.
want to now. Now I'm like, now that I know all these things about Squeeze, I like want to see them live. Yeah, so that's really it for chronological order of things. Are there any other like personal anecdotes that you'd want to talk about, or like
Parting
fun
thoughts.
facts or something?
I mean, no, it's just like it's kind of fun, like just. Thinking out loud, like what we were talking about earlier, how they were a band that when I was a kid that like myself and my elders could enjoy on different levels.
Yeah.
And now, I mean, I think more than any band, just because they've been in my life longer. I mean, since like literally, before I knew what music was. Like, since I was just like a little rugrat myself. Like, I feel it is something that I always come back to, and I always like understand it a little bit more. And
Nice,
I mean, I'm definitely personally like more of a sounds guy than a lyrics guy, but like the lyricist that I love, there's just something I can't put my finger on. It just speaks to me, or it doesn't.
Yeah, I remember like going to a art school, like a lot of like, it's funny when you're a freshman in college, like, or like icebreakers, whatever, that people try to do, and one of the big ones I remember everyone talking about all the time was like, are you lyrics or sound? And like, I feel like I can never decide, like, because I literally listen to so much like neoclassical and noise, but then I love like old songwriters and stuff, so like that's kind of interesting. And I feel like this band I would peg kind of more as lyrically, just right off the bat, but I do get the sound thing there for sure.
Well, they just like they deliver on the hooks, or like they deliver in both departments, and all.
I feel like I can never decide if I'm like
you
more
don't
sound or
have to.
lyrics.
It takes all kinds, but yeah, a long live Squeeze, I guess. And shout out to my folks, Steve and Elizabeth, for bringing Cool for Cats into my world.
Yeah, you rarely hear someone be like, that's my family's favorite band, so that's like a really unique perspective I feel like you brought to this.
Yeah.
Cool. Well,
thanks so much for having me,
yeah,
Olivia.
thanks for
really
being
a
on
pleasure.
the podcast.
Yeah.
And you guys should listen to Squeeze. Yeah, I guess that's it. Thank you for listening to Bandsplainer.